Hi, I'm Berta Jo from Spanish Fork Senior Citizen Center. We just wanted to check in with all of you and let you know that we're thinking of you and we miss you and we love you. We're hoping that this little program that we've put together will entertain you and bring a smile to your face. And always remember, when we reopen, we want you to come back so we can always surround you with people who care.
Attention, hut. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Present arms.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Mountain Land Association of Governments has an option for senior citizens for a congregate lunch with a drive-through pickup at the Springville Senior Citizen Center. You must make a reservation to pick up your lunch the day before you want it. To make a reservation, call the Springville Senior Citizen Center at 801-489-8738. Ask for Betty and tell her that you would like to reserve a lunch for the following day. The next day, drive to the Springville Senior Citizen Center, located at 65 East, 200 South in Springville. Arrive between 11:30 a.m. and noon. They will have cones that will direct you to drive up onto the sidewalk in front of the senior center. There is no need to get out of your car. The donation box will also be available for your donation for the meal. They will hand you your meal as you drive through. Lunches are available Monday through Friday, and this will only be available during the coronavirus situation. If you can't go yourself, just send a family member or a neighbor. Remember to call a day in advance to 801-489-8738 to reserve your lunch. And be sure to tell them thanks.
It's joke time. Time for a few jokes. So, a blonde driving a car became lost in a snowstorm. She didn't panic, however, because she remembered what her dad had once told her. If you ever get stuck in a snowstorm, just wait for a snowplow to come by and follow it. Sure enough, pretty soon a snowplow came by and she started to follow it. She followed the plow for about 45 minutes. Finally, the driver of the truck got out and asked her what she was doing. And she explained that her dad had told her that if she ever got stuck in a snowstorm to follow a plow. The driver nodded and said, "Well, I'm done with the Walmart parking lot. Do you want to follow me over to Best Buy now?" Okay, here's another one. The Indians asked their chief in autumn if the winter was going to be cold or not. Not really knowing an answer, the chief replies that the winter was going to be cold and that the members of the village were to collect wood to be prepared. Being a good leader, he then went to a phone booth and called the National Weather Service and asked, "Is this winter to be cold?" The man on the phone responded, "This winter is going to be quite cold indeed." So the chief went back to speed up his people to collect even more wood to be prepared. A week later, he called the National Weather Service again. "Is it going to be a very cold winter?" "Yes," the man replied, "it's going to be a very cold winter." So the chief goes back to his people and orders them to go and find every scrap of wood they can find. 2 weeks later, he calls the National Weather Service again. "Are you absolutely sure that this winter is going to be very cold?" "Absolutely," the man replies. "The Indians are collecting wood like crazy." Okay. My husband and I purchased an old home in northern New York State from 2 elderly sisters. Winter was fast approaching, and I was concerned about the house's lack of insulation. "If they could have lived here all those years, so can we," my husband confidently declared. One November night, the temperature plunged to below zero, and we woke up to find the interior walls covered with frost. My husband called the sisters to ask how they had kept the house warm. After a rather brief conversation, he hung up. "For the past 30 years, he muttered, They've gone to Florida for the winter.
So I'm Heather Lyman. I'm one of the nurses with Maple Creek Home Health and Hospice, and just in talking with some of my patients and my coworkers, there's a lot of confusion out there and a lot of crazy conflicting information. So we thought that we would just do a little breakdown and give you some simple facts and some simple things that you can do to keep yourself safe. So the first thing is just, what is coronavirus? It's a virus that's actually been around for a long time, but it was animal-based, and just in November, it finally mutated enough that it was able to jump from animals to humans, and that's why this disease has become such a dangerous disease, because we humans have no immunity to it. There's some things that are out in the community that are just misinformation. So we'll try to give you some just quick things that break it down so you've got some knowledge. The symptoms of coronavirus, there's 4 main symptoms: sore throat, cough, fever, and shortness of breath. Fever is anything that's 100.4 or higher. That cough is just a dry, I can't quit coughing all day long kind of cough. The sore throat comes on kind of in the beginning of the disease, and then the shortness of breath. The people that have had coronavirus talk about feeling like there's a belt or a band around their lungs to where they just cannot get a breath, or that elephant on your chest feeling. So if you have one or more of these symptoms, just go see a doctor. Just don't wait. The other thing that makes this kind of a dangerous disease is that you can have it for up to 14 days without any symptoms at all, and that makes it really easy to transmit and really hard to contain. So that's where the social distancing comes in. If you are keeping a 6-foot distance, then it makes it much harder to give that disease to somebody else. The science that's kind of coming in is that it can last to maybe up to 9 days on a surface, definitely up to 5 days, and it can last up to 3 hours in the air. So you can see how it's just harder to keep that contained. How's it spread? So coronavirus, or COVID-19, is a droplet disease, and that means that if somebody who's infected sneezes or coughs, there's kind of a plume that comes out, and that can just last in the air for up to 3 hours. And then if somebody who's not infected walks through that plume and breathes in, or is coughed directly on, they can breathe that in and then take in the disease. Or somebody coughs and that plume goes out, and then it starts to settle, and it settles on surfaces. And if you touch that surface and then touch your hands to your face, then you can get the disease that way. That, again, is where social distancing comes in. If you are 6 feet away from any other person, you kind of put yourself out of the radius of that plume. And if you're not going out, if you're watching who's coming into your home, and you're limiting the times that you go out and the people that come in, that's just fewer opportunities for that disease to spread. There's some simple steps that we can take to protect ourselves. So again, stay home. Just limit that opportunity. And then the hand washing. We cannot stress that enough. Wash your hands when you leave your house, wash your hands when you get to the grocery store, wash your hands when you leave the grocery store. Just have some hand sanitizer. Just do it every time you think of it. Every time you touch another surface is just a good rule of thumb. Then at your home, there's some things that you can do. So a couple of times a day, take some Clorox wipes or some Clorox in water, just like a diluted solution, and then you're going to want to wipe your surfaces down. Wipe in one motion. So just like this. If you do this, you just kind of smear it around a little bit. And then the other thing that you need to do is, as you're wiping, let that surface stay wet for at least 10 seconds. That helps to really get in there and kill that virus. And then if you've got them, wear gloves when you're washing. You're going to want to do doorknobs, just the heavily touched areas. Doorknobs, light switches, door frames, drawer pulls, tabletops, countertops, anything that you're touching all the time. And that phone is, we forget about that one. If you've got them, wear gloves, and then take those gloves off, put them deep down in the trash, and then go wash your hands. So I know it's scary out there, and I know there's a lot of information, but we'll get through this. I know knowledge is power, and when I feel like I know a little bit more, I feel less anxious. So just know we love you, and stay safe out there.
This is a true story that was published in the Reader's Digest in 1975 in their survival stories. It began like any other May morning in California. The sky was blue, the sun hot. A slight breeze riffled the glistening waters of San Diego Bay. At the Naval Air Base on North Island, all was calm. At 9:45, at Walter Ospoff, a sandy-haired 23-year-old Marine second lieutenant from Akron, Ohio, boarded a DC-2 transport for a routine parachute jump. Lieutenant Bill Lowry, a 34-year-old Navy test pilot from New Orleans, was already putting his observation plane through its paces. And John McCants, a husky 41-year-old aviation chief machinist mate from Jordan, Montana, was checking out the aircraft that he was scheduled to fly later. Before the sun was high in the noonday sky, these three men would be linked forever in one of history's most spectacular mid-air rescues. Ossipoff was a seasoned parachutist, a former collegiate wrestler, and a gymnastics star. He had joined the National Guard and then in the Marines in 1938. He had already made more than 20 jumps by May 15, 1941. That morning, his DC took off and headed for Kearney Mesa, where Ossipoff would supervise practice jumps by 12 of his men. 3 separate canvas cylinders containing ammunition and rifles were also to be parachuted overboard as part of the exercise. 9 of the men had already jumped when Ossipoff, standing a few inches from the plane's door, started to toss out the last cargo container. Somehow, the automatic release cord of his backpack parachute became looped over the cylinder, and his chute was suddenly ripped open. He tried to grab a hold of the quickly billowing silk, but the next thing he knew, he had been jerked from the plane, sucked out with such force that the impact of his body ripped a 2.5 gash in the DC-2's aluminum fuselage. Instead of flowing free, Ossipoff's open parachute now wrapped itself around the plane's tailwheel. The chute chest strapped and one of the leg straps had broken. Only the second strap was still holding, and it had slipped down Ossipoff's ankle. One by one, 24 of the 28 lines became his precariously attached harness, and the parachute snapped. He was now hanging from some 12 feet below and 15 feet behind the tail of the plane. 4 parachute shroud lines twisted around his left leg were all that kept him from being pitched to the earth. Dangling there upside down, Ossipoff had enough presence of mind to not try to release his emergency parachute. With the plane pulling him one way and the emergency chute pulling him another, he realized that he would be torn in half. Conscientious all the while, he knew that he was hanging by one leg, spinning and bouncing, and he was aware that his ribs hurt. He did not know then that 2 of his ribs and 3 vertebrae had been fractured. Inside the plane, the DC-2 crew struggled to pull Ossipoff to safety, but they could not reach him. The aircraft was starting to run low on fuel, but an emergency landing with Ossipoff dragging behind would certainly smash him to death. And pilot Harold Johnson had no radio control or contact with the ground. To attract attention below, Johnson eased the transport down to the 300 feet and started circling North Island. A few people at the base noticed the plane coming by every few minutes, but they assumed it was towing some sort of target. Meanwhile, Bill Lowry had landed his plane and was walking toward his office when he glanced up. He and John McCants, who was working nearby, saw at the same time the figure dangling from the plane. As the DC-2 circled once again, Lowry yelled to McCants, "There's a man hanging on that line. Do you suppose we can get him?" McCants answered grimly, "We can try." Lowry shouted to his mechanics to get his plane ready for takeoff. It was an SOC-1, a two-seated, open cockpit observation plane, less than 27 feet long, recalled Lowry afterward. "I didn't even know how much fuel it had." Turning McCants, he said, "Let's go." Lowry and McCants had never flown together before, but the two men seemed to take it for granted that they were going to attempt the impossible. There was only one decision to be made, Lowry later said quietly, and that was to get him. How? We didn't know. We had no time to plan. Nor was there time to get through to their commanding officer and request permission for the flight. Lowry simply told the tower, "Give me a green light. I'm taking off." At the last moment, a Marine ran out to the plane with a hunting knife for cutting Ospoff loose and dumped it in McCann's lap. As the SOC-1 roared aloft, all activity around San Diego seemed to stop. Civilians crowded around rooftops, children stopped playing at recess, and the men of North Island strained their eyes upward. With murmured prayers and pounding hearts, the watchers agonized through every move in the impossible mission. Within minutes, Lowry and McCants were under the transport, flying at 300 feet. They made 5 approaches, but the air proved too bumpy to try a rescue. Since radio communication between the two planes was impossible, Lowry hand-signaled Johnson to head out over the Pacific, where the air would be smoother, and they climbed to 3,000 feet. Johnson held his plane on a straight course and reduced speed to that of the smaller plane, 100 miles an hour. Lowry flew back and away from Ospoff, but level with him. McCants, who was in the open seat in back of Lowry, saw that Ospoff was hanging by 1 foot and that blood was dripping from his helmet. Lowry edged the plane closer with such precision that his maneuvers jibbed with the swings of Ospoff's inert body. His timing had to be exact, so that Ospoff did not smash into the SOC-1's propeller. Finally, Lowry slipped his underwing under Ospoff's shroud lines, and McCants, standing upright in the rear cockpit, with the plane still going 100 miles an hour, 3,000 feet above the sea, lunged for Ospoff. He grabbed him at the waist, and Ospoff flung his arms around McCants' shoulder in a death grip. McCants pulled Ospoff into the plane, but since it was only a two-seater, the next problem was where to put him. As Lowry eased the SOC-1 forward to get some slack in the chute lines, McCants managed to stretch Ospoff's body across the top of the fuselage with Ospoff's head in his lap. Because McCants was using both of his hands to hold Ospoff in a vise, there was no way for him to cut the cords that still attached Ospoff to the DC-2. Lowry then nosed his plane inch by inch closer to the transport, and with incredible precision, used his propeller to cut the shroud lines. After hanging for 33 minutes between life and death, Ospoff was finally free. Lowry had flown so close to the transport that he had nicked a 12-inch gash in its tail. But now the parachute, abruptly detached along the shroud lines, drifted downward and wrapped itself around Lowry's rudder. That meant that Lowry had to fly the SOC-1 without being able to control it properly and with most of Ospoff's body still on the outside. Yet 5 minutes later, Lowry somehow managed to touch down at North Island with that little plane to stop. When it rolled to a stop, Ossipoff finally lost consciousness, but not before he heard sailors applauding the landing. Later on, after lunch, Lowry and McCants went back to their usual duties. 3 weeks later, both men were flown to Washington, D.C., where Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox awarded them the Distinguished Flying Cross for executing one of the most brilliant and daring rescues in naval history. Ossipoff spent the next 6 months in the hospital. The following January, completely recovered and newly promoted to first lieutenant, he went back to the parachute jumping. The morning he was to make his first jump after the accident, he was cool and laconic, as usual. His friends, though, were nervous. One after another, they went up to reassure him. Each volunteered to jump first so he could follow. Ossipoff grinned and shook his head. "The hell with that," he said. "Fasten the parachute. I know damn well I'm going to make it." And he did. I'm sure that there are a lot of you veterans may even be aware of the story or even remember it happening.
Okay, more jokes. John and Mary were sitting down to their usual morning cup of coffee, listening to the weather report on the radio. There will be 3 to 5 inches of snow today, and a snow emergency has been declared, the weather report said. You must park your cars on the odd-numbered side of the streets. John said, "Geez, okay," and got up from his coffee. The next day, they were sitting down with their morning cups of coffee. The weather forecast was, there will be 2 to 4 inches of snow today, and a snow emergency has been declared. You must park your cars on the even-numbered side of the streets. Again, John replied, "Oh, gee, okay," and got up from his coffee. 2 days later, again, they were sitting down with their cups of coffee, and the weather forecast said, there will be 6 to 8 inches of snow today, and a snow emergency has been declared. You must park your cars on the... And the power went out. And John didn't get the rest of the instructions. He turned to Mary. "Geez, what am I going to do now?" Mary replied, John, just leave the car in the garage today." Okay, one of my favorites. A Minnesota couple decided to vacation in Florida during the winter. They planned to stay at the very same hotel where they had spent their honeymoon 20 years earlier. Because of hectic schedules, it was difficult to coordinate their travel schedules. So the husband left Minnesota and flew to Florida on Thursday. His wife would fly down the following day. The husband checked into the hotel. There was a computer in his room, so he decided to send an email to his wife. However, he accidentally left out one letter in her email address, and without realizing his error, he sent the email. Meanwhile, somewhere in Houston, a widow had just returned home from her husband's funeral. He was a minister of many years who had been called home to glory following a sudden heart attack. The widow decided to check her email, expecting messages from relatives and friends. After reading the first message, she fainted. The widow's son rushed into the room, found his mother on the floor, and saw the computer screen, which read, "To my loving wife. Subject, I've arrived. Date, 16th of May, 2010. I know you're surprised to hear from me. They have computers here now, and you are allowed to send emails to your loved ones. I've just arrived and have been checked in. I see that everything has been prepared for your arrival tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you then. Hope your journey is not as uneventful as mine was. P.S. Sure is hot down here."
Music, maestro. And I sing
Just let